How do I simplify the scene is a question I'm often asked. In this advanced watercolor tutorial, I will give you my tips for taking a complex scene and simplifying it to make it easier to paint. Hello, I'm Tim Wilmot, a watercolor painter, and I produce full-length video tutorials with commentary, which will help you improve your watercolor techniques and hopefully create some great looking paintings. This is the scene I'm going to paint in this demonstration. This is the River Tamar in the UK. And as you can see, there are many boats. How do I tackle a scene like this? How do I make it simpler? So first, we are painting into the light. Contre jour, as they say. So objects become, or many objects become silhouetted and simpler. Secondly, we want to think about shapes. So when I look at a scene, I could squint my eyes, or I could, if I could just take this image and blur it slightly. Let's go right down to about that kind of level there. So what we can now do is try and pick out some of the major shapes. So for example, the middle ground shapes of the jetty and some middle boats there. Very easy to pick those out as one kind of value over the buoys, around another boat, and back up again. So all of that is almost one value. A boat over here, very simple shape. So squint the eyes, that might make things a little bit easier for you. Let me just bring things back into focus. Next, values. Think about values in watercolor. How dark or how light is it? And to assist you there, well, to help you here, I could go to a black and white photograph of this same scene, and that would make it easier to think of things on a grayscale from very white to black. So this is very dark down here. The very light areas, well, is going to be the top of the cabin of this boat. There's some boats in the middle ground as well, the tops of these buoys, these oversized buoys. I don't know what they are. They're massive buoys there. The light hitting this left-hand boat here, the top of that cabin, the top there, and this lower platform here as well. So go black and white. Think of things in values. Think of things as shades of grey. Fourthly, remove things which aren't important to the composition. So when I look at this, well, a striking one is the corner of this boat. Now, this is a photo of one of my own photographs. But if you were looking at a scene and there was something on the right, something on the left, something in the background, remove it. So that is one obvious thing. It's actually bringing nothing to the party. So I'm going to remove it. I'm not even going to bother contemplating painting that or part of that boat. So remove things. That's my fourth tip. Remove things which aren't important to the composition. Now, tip number 5. In the initial drawing, so I always start off with a drawing. I'll come to that in a minute when I start the demo proper. In the initial drawing, don't draw every single thing you see. So every little detail of these objects. We don't want to see every particular thing in the scene. So the more we look at the scene, the more details we're going to see. maybe a little trick is to observe a scene for a minute, try and memorize it for a minute, count to 60, memorize it, and then turn away, and then try and draw what you remember. That way you're going to remove all of the funny little bits of rigging and bits of paraphernalia on the tops of boats and so on. You're stripping things down to the bare minimum. So in that drawing phase, I normally keep to about 5 minutes or so for a painting of this size. That works best for me. Maybe you could do it quicker. Maybe you might take a little bit longer. But I'm just getting in the main objects. Tip number 6, background. So there's a background here, the other side of the river. So this is the River Tamar, and we are looking probably due south. Over on the other side is Devon, the county of Devon and Plymouth, and this side, this is Saltash and Cornwall. Well, primarily this side here, this is all Devon. But again, it's background. It just think of it as just one value. There are some little bits of highlights. So there is this building on the left-hand side there. It's catching a little bit of the light. Might make a nice feature. There's some yachts with their sails having a little race in the middle of the river. But keep it simple. I mean, the background is over in the background. Keep things simple, and also the same may be true of the foreground. So, well, there's nothing really much in the foreground here, but you might think, well, if there's another boy or something of interest in the foreground, just think about it and consider removing it. But certainly the background, I want to keep that nice and simple. Point 7, tip 7, keep brush strokes to a minimum. A bit like a game of golf, you win with the least number of strokes. So try and keep it loose and big brush. Think about the brushes you're using. So the size of the brush in relation to the size of your paper. Go big, go large. As long as the brush has got a good point and a good edge to it, you've got a good bit of control. But we want to keep brush strokes to a minimum. And finally, my tip number 8: edges and brush marks. Edges and brush marks that the way you deploy them, the way you put them on the paper, can give an illusion of detail. I'll show you a number of different examples of that. So there are some danger areas in this painting. I've mentioned the background already. The top right hand, over on the right hand side here, these parked cars. Too much detail. Just think of shapes. Imagine you're an alien. You just landed on planet Earth. You don't know what a car is. You don't know what a boat is. You're just thinking of shapes and values and objects. So don't bother with all those, or I certainly won't bother with all those cars. This blue boat here, it's missing the front end of it. Yeah, I think it's truncated on the right-hand side there. Remove that. I mentioned this quarter of a boat down here in the foreground. Won't bother with that. This lamppost with these flags and bunting going across, and it goes over to the right there. Yeah, for me, that's kind of 50-50. I could include it, may not include it. I don't know whether a lamppost is right for a sort of seaside type scene like this. I know it's a nice lamppost, but for me, I might miss it. So there we are, my 8 tips for keeping things simple, trying to tackle a complicated scene in watercolor. So let's get painting. If you want to keep seeing my reference photo as I paint the demo, a good idea is to open up a tab, go to this same video in that tab and pause on it in the opening few minutes where I show the picture full screen. Or better still, and excuse the plug, you can join my Patreon scheme, patreon.com/Tim Wilmot, where I share high resolution images and my paintings as well, and provide critiques of your paintings. So the paper I'm using here is Saunders Waterford. This is cold press, 300 grams, and the dimensions are 15 inches by 11 inches. I've secured it, as you may be able to see, with some masking tape. The paper will buckle a little bit. I don't pre-wet my paper. I don't, in this one, I'm not actually going to pre-wet it or damp the paper. It will buckle a little bit, but it doesn't matter. It will dry flat. Most paper will dry flat when it's dry. So, going back to what I was saying initially about simplification in this fairly advanced scene, I'm just keeping things to the main shapes. So I briefly started off with the background. I could actually start with one of the key objects, start drawing that, and then work my way out. Or sometimes I just start at the top or over on the left-hand side and work my way down through the scene. And it doesn't matter if I get things wrong, of course, with pencil. You can rub things out and start things again. But I want to get in, as I say, the main shapes of these boats and how they're all connected with each other. There's really no boat in isolation. They're all sort of joined together. The pencil I'm using is a 3B pencil, so it's nice and soft, and it's going to give me those dark lines, so it's going to make it easier for me to follow those lines when I do the painting. So I don't want to necessarily have any boats that are sort of cut in half in the picture, half out. And as you can see, I'm just joining them all up, working my way over the scene, back over the left-hand side, some distant yacht in the middle ground. Then in that middle ground, I've got that jetty with some upright posts. The thing like the jetty, the more you look at it, the more detail you're going to see. Bits of rigging attached to it, the top planks, little poles as well. You've just got to abbreviate what you see. Coming back down into the middle area. When you look at a group of boats like this, there's quite a few just horizontal lines, and then now and again there's a little vertical, a bit of a curve with the bow or the stern of the boat. But very often when you're looking at boats like this, we're looking at them sideways on, it's just lots of horizontal lines, and relatively easy to get in there. So these are a couple of very large buoys, which to me, I'm not a nautical person, but they seem overly large for the size of boats there. I'm sure they've got a purpose. Maybe somebody watching this video knows exactly why they are so large. Now, being contre-jour, looking into the light, the boats and their shadows, they're almost as one. That the boats will be quite light, but will come down quite dark with the shadows coming towards us. Sometimes I will actually draw in the outline of the shadows. Other times I might just do them freehand when I come to do the painting. So that was the drawing done, and so it was pretty quick, not too long. It would make under 5 minutes, I think. And now for the all-important painting. I often think of my paintings, the way I paint, going through about 4 stages. So we've just done the first stage, which is getting in the drawing. And then the second stage is putting in the initial wash to cover all of the paper except for those areas that are going to stay bright and light. So I've got to do a bit of careful painting around some of those objects. That's why I was fairly careful with the drawing to get right in my mind where those light areas are going to be. And so with this, starting from the top, I've got a slight slope on the board, maybe about 10 degrees or so. So gravity is going to play a little part in the paint coming down. And the sky was done so quick. It's just really quick. Because the sky isn't a massive part of the overall composition, we don't want to spend an awful lot of time laboring on it. So very quick. I started with a bit of yellow ochre across the horizon, and then a bit of darker blue, cerulean blue, bit of a mixture of cerulean blue and cobalt blue coming down over the top. Sometimes I might start with the blue, the top of the sky blue, and then I'll gradually mix in a bit of yellow ochre or maybe a bit of alizarin crimson, depending on the time of day as I come down to the horizon. But it's stronger at the top and weaker at the bottom, depending on how much the sky we can see. If it's a thin slither of a sky, then maybe it's almost all one value. But here it's about, what would you say? It's about a third down. So I've got to have a little bit of a graded wash there. So a bit darker at the top, lighter as I come down. Likewise the sea. We can't really see much of the sea. It's just really less than 10% of the overall area of the painting. So very simple flat wash there. And now I'm coming down to, after painting over most of those boats, I'm now coming down to this, well, it's a beach really. I'm not sure if the locals would call it a beach, but the river here is at low tide. It's exposing a bit of a shingly type beach with lots of little stones and things on it. So I want to try and think about how to replicate the structure of that. Now, the beach does sort of go over to the top right corner, come down. It doesn't really matter what color I do these boats. I'm going to be going over them again with another layer, another darker layer. So, but that layer will sort of inherit some of the colors of what I'm doing here, but it doesn't, I don't need to get too hung up about what color I do these boats, because I am going to be going over them again. Now, normally with a wash, you'd lay down horizontal lines. You've got a fully loaded brush laying down horizontal lines, and you gradually come down your paper to the bottom. Here, as I did with the sky, I tend to do a bit of a sort of haphazard action, going all over the place with a big brush, as big a brush as I can have for the size of the paper. So go for the biggest brush, and I'm using a Raphael synthetic squirrel brush here. There are a lot of them around now, synthetic squirrel. They will behave the same as a natural brush. They've got very good water retention. They produce some interesting brush marks as well. They won't damage the surface of the paper. They're nice and soft. If you're laying down, if you're actually continually going down on the paper. So, yeah, a big brush is important. A big brush with good water retaining capabilities. Now, after I laid down that initial wash on the beach, I then mixed some darker, thicker color and did these sort of dark lines where, with the tide, you get these sort of, if you look back at the original photograph, there's these sort of darker lines. What I'm doing here, just do a bit of splattering. And timing here is of the essence. So the paint was drying till it was sort of what I would call it like a damp stage. So if you hold the paper against the light, you can still see a little bit of a shine on it. It's gone drier than the moist stage, where it's just too wet. If you did splattering when it's too wet, really you just won't get the effect of these little quaint little marks there. Yes, so going back to those dark lines, they're quite useful because they are helping us with the perspective of the scene and thinking about the complexity of the surface of that beach, all the little bits of shingle and different colored sand and different sizes of material and debris on the beach. We couldn't hope to replicate that. We're trying to create a piece of art here. We're not trying to, my style is not photorealistic type painting. I'm just trying to give an impression of the scene. So a little bit of splattering there, clear water, synthetic brush, pick up a little bit of water, bit of gentle splattering. You could start at the side of your paper, just as a little experiment before committing to go into the main part of the painting. It could go horribly wrong if you don't practice it a little bit. But timing is important. Yeah, just make sure that the paper is damp before you do that splattering. Now, the background where I'm actually painting now, it's actually got quite dry. You would have seen I got the hairdryer out just to speed things up a bit. I could have actually gone in with the background while the paper was still damp. That would have given me a nice sort of soft edge, as if it was sort of like a hazy a day, and you know, just to give me that soft edge. But painting's all about these different edges, so that can be achieved by doing a little bit of wet in wet. You see, I'm just connecting the middle ground with the background there. Very important point. Don't want to have things all kind of separate. I want to join things up as much as possible, give some cohesion to the overall composition, and connect things, join these different objects together. As you can see, I've very accurately painted the cars in the top right corner. And over on the, I should have said over on the left-hand side, the background, there's the little bit of highlighted building. I don't know what it is over on the far side of the river, but just giving an impression of something over there, buildings or structures or whatever, on that side. Also at this stage, I'm going down in size on brushes. I'm using a slightly smaller brush. Now, in fact, the brush I used previously was well, a very cheap brush. I think it was about 50p or something like that. And I've deliberately hacked it about with a pair of scissors just to give a really strange edge to it. And these different brush marks, they can give the illusion of detail just by using dry brush strokes, or using a little bit of wet in wet or wet on wet techniques where you get a soft edge, and it just gives the illusion of something going on then. And somebody looking at it, they're just gonna make up their own mind about what that is. Boats, I think they can be quite easy to paint in this way, where we're looking at them sideways on, particularly at the distance. They're just a stroke of paint drawn horizontally, in my case, left to right, and just a few little dots here and there. They could be little buoys or something going on there. You can see where I had the water line of the far side, and it wasn't completely straight. I've utilized some of those little humps as a little bit of highlighting for some boats in the middle of the river. So that boat on the left-hand side, I've drawn the reflections there. The boat and the reflections, they're almost as one. Just touch the surface, just see how it's drying. Because at some stage of the painting, we need to have dry paper. It can't be wet. It's got to be 100% tinder dry. Continuing on now to the middle area of the painting, you can just see that I squeezed out some extra neutral tint there. Oh, I should have actually described my palette. So the palette on the right hand side, neutral tint at the top, coming down I've got burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, viridian green, cobalt turquoise or cobalt green, then cerulean blue, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, Windsor red, basically a bright red. I used to use cadmium red, but changed to Windsor red. It's a good substitute. Then below the red, I've got a light red, great for doing Mediterranean type scenes, or, well, a light red. and cadmium orange, and then lemon yellow. So this middle ground here is being done with darker paint, slightly thicker than I use with the background. And I do cover the ratio of water to pigment or water to paint in a previous video. Just go back to my channel, and this was a video that was actually labeled up as a beginner type video, but there's some intermediate stuff in there as well. But I do cover paint mixing in a bit more detail, and the fact that sometimes I'm actually mixing more than I'm painting, or sometimes I will actually mix the paint on the paper if I think I know what I'm doing. But there's that jetty, and I'm sort of doing that shape I described earlier when I just drew that line around the jetty area. Just sort of defining that shape a bit more. There's a distant boat. It's sort of connected. Its back end to something beyond it. Now this is a fairly small Raphael brush, so it's still a mop brush, but it's one of the smallest Raphael brushes it's in the soft aqua range, if you want to look it up. But there's lots of other manufacturers that are brush manufacturers similar. Princeton, Skoda, they all do similar ones. And here we are, just these horizontal lines, just giving us the impression of boats or craft. Maybe I just close up some of the gaps between these horizontal lines here and there, where there could be some more of a vertical structure. Trying to be wary, trying to be vigilant of these light areas I painted around, trying to keep those and not accidentally paint over them. Back to my cheap brush again. Darker boat right in the middle there. And another boat. The paper I'm using, Saunders Waterford, and paper like it that is cotton based, they will remain, they're quite absorbent, and they will remain wet for quite some time, which is good in watercolor because it gives you more time to play around with things and make things it just gels much better than a wood pulp or traditional, or should I say cheaper, that's probably the word I'm looking for, cheaper watercolor paper, because they dry too quickly. Sometimes they're not as absorbent. Dries quicker, and you're having to work quicker. That can be a little bit more stressful. You want this to be a relaxing thing to do. I was looking at the brush there. You get a sense for, on the brush, when you've put it in you've done a bit of mixing, you picked up a bit of water, you've done a bit of mixing, you sort of get a second sense and intuition, if you do it enough times, for is there enough paint on that brush for what you're doing. Now the all-important boat here on the left-hand side. It's connecting to about 2 or 3 different boats. Things just look, in a scene like this, things would look a little bit odd if I had a boat just isolated on its own. It would just look a little bit lonely, and it wouldn't, from a composition point of view, I just don't think it works. Really, these boats, they're just like painting cars. They've got a roof, they've got a windscreen, what I'm doing now, they've got a bonnet, they've got the side of the car, the underneath of the car, they've got a shadow. On a sunny day, they've got a shadow coming out from the car. They are, if you're good at drawing, and painting cars, you're going to be good at drawing and painting boats. The only slight challenge with boats is the curvature of the hull, which is what I'm doing now, just to get that right. And that's where getting the drawing right is ultra important. Getting the drawing correct as regards the curve of the side of the hull and the bow and the stern. Just getting that right before committing to doing the painting. I'm going to paint around the fenders on the side of the boat. Fenders are what makes a boat, rather looking like a car. So yeah, we've got to put some fenders in to make them a little bit more realistic. And I use my fingers there just to mix things around. Picked up a little bit of lavender. I do have a little bit of lavender down the bottom, in the bottom right corner of my palette, that I sometimes use in conjunction with another colour. And it's a sort of, lavender is a sort of like a opaque type colour, quite thick in consistency. It's quite nice to use it now and again. And good to add it in when you're doing wet in wet, going into a wetter, thinner area, because it's more sort of pasty in nature. It's going to behave itself and not travel too much. Now, going in with my Raphael brush here to create a little bit of the reflections coming from the hull. I normally use a natural squirrel brush for reflections, but I've got this Raphael brush on hand. Sometimes when I'm painting lots of cars and lots of boats and their dark shadows or reflections, I'll have 2 brushes on hand. So one brush for doing the car, the body of the car, or the hull, and then one brush, maybe slightly smaller, for doing the shadow. So 2 brushes on hand, you can't see them, they're over to the right. Just makes it easier rather than constantly, if you're just using one brush for it, it just can be a little bit more tedious by having to wash things out. But so I use a couple of brushes on hand, maybe similar in size, but in this example, my shadow brushes are going to be a little bit smaller, and yeah, it's fully loaded, ready to go. Things will dry a little bit lighter. It might seem a bit severe here with the darkness of it, but sometimes you need to go darker than you think. With watercolor, it will dry lighter, so you've got to compensate by going in, thinking about values, going in a little bit darker than you think. So these lines I'm doing there, I'm going over the masking tape on the left-hand side. I don't want to stop drawing those lines before the edge of the paper, because when I peel off the tape to reveal a sort of crisp white border around my painting, I want these lines to go over that, over to the edge, make it appear as if they are going further on. They're quite similar in colour. A lot of these boats will introduce more of that reddish boat. So with this one, this is quite an important one because there's a bit of light on top of that cabin. And that's another point, trying to have a little bit of light against dark. If you saw a previous video of mine where I did the interior mill scene and we had a bright door with a very dark background, that works quite well generally in watercolor, having an area of light against the dark. So think about that. Immediately, as soon as I've done the hull of the boat, I'll go in with the shadow and against gravity. So the shadow mixture here is a little bit thicker than the consistency of the hull. That was a little bit weaker, more water content. And the shadow is traveling upwards. It's going against gravity. Whatever the scientific terminology is, osmosis or whatever it is, they're joining. It's traveling. It's moving of its own accord upwards and giving a nice soft edge. If it doesn't travel too quickly, I might just quickly smudge it, or with a tissue, a paper towel or tissue, just dab it a little bit just to move it along, or I might lift out with a damp brush. So that's one of these are the two white boys, and a bit of shadow for them quickly there. Back to my cheap brush. Darker, thicker colours as we come towards us. Now with the edge of the hull, you don't need to be too precise with your with the curves. It can help if it's a little bit broken now and again. Just can give the impression of something going on the top of the hull. It's the superstructure or whatever. And there, with my shadow brush, I shall call it, my darker brush, preloaded. Here we are with a paper towel. Just do a little bit of dabbing. Sometimes when the paint's been allowed to dry a little bit, you're going to get a softer edge when you do this lift off, and you might need to hold it down on the paper quite firmly for maybe 10-15 seconds or so, and that would just leach, it would just suck up a little bit of that paint, even if it's almost getting quite dry. It will still work. So again, timing or using the paper towel is quite important. Right, the boat on the right hand side, I'm going to make more red. You can see how I've joined these boats together. Here's the cabin. I'm just picking up this Windsor red there, quite a bright red, but it's been mucked up with some other colours. And then back with my shadow brush, picked up a bit of neutral tint. Dab a little bit into the side of the boat as well, just so it's not too perfect. You don't want everything too precise. Got to muck about with it a little bit just to mess it up and give the impression of a sort of shabbiness to some of these boats. They're not ultra new. So the next stage is reach for what I call my detail brush. Going to get into some little bits of detail now, not too much, but just giving the impression, I've got to put in some masks and lines along the hulls of the boats. So this is a smallish synthetic round brush, and I didn't draw in these masks. I'm just sort of putting in freehand, as random as I can. The more I think about these masks, they're going to appear too regular, so I've got to do it quite quickly, and different sizes and different distances between them. So quite quickly, and they're also serving a useful purpose because they are joining the middle ground with the background. Do you see? So some of those, as I'm doing there, they're connecting these different areas of the scene together. I could have, that lamppost I said that I was going to leave out. Well, I haven't put it in, but that too could have served the purpose. Certainly I would have had them in a street scene. Street scene, yeah. Definitely have some lamppost, street furniture, just to join things together. Now, another thing that makes a boat more realistic is a waterline. So just a thin slither of a dark line along the waterline can help. Some marks across the top of the hull as well. Perhaps a few little windows here and there. They all add to giving the impression, the illusion of these boats. So I'm trying to draw these lines all in one go. And it doesn't matter, talking earlier about brush marks, brush strokes, giving the impression of detail. If they're fairly dry brush marks, they can actually create some interesting marks on the paper. If you haven't tried it before, just almost pick up pure pigments. I'm not actually, as you can see here, I'm not actually picking up too much water. I'll just search around my palette for a little bit of water, pick up some dirty water from somewhere, but keep it deliberately quite dry. I'm using tube paint here, which I do prefer over hard pan, so it's normally quite moist and quite workable with. So it's amenable to me just using this brush and predominantly here just using these dry brush strokes, giving hopefully the illusion of some detail for this initially this quite complex scene. Something else that's going to really help the scene are these lines of rigging and chains, and some of them are catching light. Now I could have used a rigger brush for this. A rigger brush or a sword or dagger brush, you know, they're fairly long hairs and they've got quite a good point to them. Good water retaining features as well, but I prefer just to use this same brush here. And it does run out of steam quite a lot, so you get these little sort of lost and found and not continuous lines. There is quite a dominant mask going down the middle of the scene. So again, it's just a dry brush stroke. I'm doing it in parts, but I'm not going over it too many times. It's sort of, we're looking into the light, so we don't want it to be too solid. We've got to be able to see little edges and gaps and imperfections. At this stage, I'm really just I'm just sort of dancing around the scene, thinking about little bits I could emphasize. I've got to do a little bit more on the beach, I think, but picking up the markings along the boats. What I was doing there was just making sure I had a flat edge to the brush, which makes it a lot easier when you're doing a mark like that. Just one continuous line, almost a dry brush, not too much moisture on the brush. Another one lower down. It's an old boat, so it's not too perfect. What I'm doing now is that splattering I did earlier. They could quite easily be little stones and shingles and things. I might need to supplement it with a few more darker bit of darker splattering here. So what I'm doing is picking up some dark paint, sort of 50-50 mixture of paint to water. And then with a synthetic brush, just tapping it fairly close to the paper, tapping it against my finger, or it could be something else, just to force that splattering marks out. Now I don't want to overdo it, and I want to keep it to the foreground, not the middle ground. So these little stones and things, we can see more of them as we come to the foreground. Just finish off this red boat there. This nearby boat needs something in the middle just to define that there is something in there. Yeah, I'll use my finger again just to move. It's still actually quite damp. That you know, it's been several minutes since I painted there. Got to be a bit careful in the middle ground. Don't too much detail. Mustn't forget this boat as well. That line up the top of the hull makes all the difference. So it's starting to be pulled together now. Now the next step is to, with a little bit of white paint, I use white, normally I use white gouache, but I'm using at the moment some paint from, I think the manufacturer called Shinhan. It's a hybrid of watercolor and gouache, but basically white paint out the tube. And just here and there, as I'm doing here, just pick out little bits of highlight, this metal chain or rope going across. Also rigging going across a dark background. That can be quite useful just to pick up a little bit of a highlight there where the sun is catching it. Some verticals, some horizontals, just where not every single mast, but just now and again pick up a few of those. Just, you know, with this quite complex scene, it can simplify things, make your life easier just by doing these random little marks with a small brush, almost freehand. Pick up a few more tops of cabins or boats. I've just spotted the need to add in a bit more detail with this dry brush. Forgot the line on that, on this nearby boat. No water again, just the paint in the palette is still quite moist, so doesn't need any water. There might be, because the palette is on a slight slope, there might be a little bit of water there in the palette, and I'd probably prefer to pick up some dirty water to do a little bit of a mixture with, rather than clear water. So these windows of the cabin, they're just a little bit too bright. So I need to, sometimes I might make up a sort of grayish mixture of white gouache and a little bit of dark paint, just to give that appearance of glass, but just need to make a few of them a little bit darker. A bit more work on the fenders. A few more little lines just to create some small waves in the little ripples in the water. Bit more white paint again. This is the shoreline. As I said just a few minutes ago, it's quite nice having a white line against a dark background, just for that bit of contrast, or a dark line against a light background, if you see what I mean. They can be quite nice. So this is the end scene, and to summarize my tutorial here of how to simplify a scene, and my tips really are as follows. We're painting, so first of all, painting against the light. So things are silhouetted. We've got some simple shapes to deal with, no complex shapes. So that's the first thing. Rather than the light coming from the side or the light behind you, that's basically making those shapes very evident and making it more of a complex thing to contemplate. So 2, think about those shapes, blur the image, squint your eyes, just pick up the main shapes there. 3, values. Think of the darks and the lights. So the light of these, the tops of these, the lights at the tops of these cabins, little bits of boats and rigging and so on, that can help give the illusion of greater detail. Now, we are painting fairly loose, and we want to try and remove things which aren't important to the composition. So I remove that boat in the bottom right corner, the car park in the top right corner, just simplified the whole background there. Plymouth in the background. Well, I left in a little bit of highlight. There was that sort of building in the background. I thought that was quite nice, that rather than being too bland in the background, we just need to, well, it's actually granulated quite nicely, the paint as well. There's a little bit of light area there as well. Could be the light through between some clouds hitting that, but nice bit of light there. In the initial drawing, don't draw every single thing you see. Keep things, well, it's related to the last point really. So I kept my drawing to about 4 minutes or so, a painting of this size, which is 15 inches by 11 inches. That works best for me, just to get in the main objects. I kept the background simple. Keep the foreground simple. The main emphasis is on the middle ground there. And keep brush strokes to a minimum. As I said, a bit like a game of golf, the winner is the one that takes the least number of strokes, as to with painting in this style, with a loose sort of painting there. Try and use as fewer strokes as possible. And then 8 edges and brush marks. We've got a number of different brush marks there. Look at that dry brush mark there, the dry brush mark of the mast. Different edges as well, soft edges, hard edges, all have a part to play in giving the illusion of detail in a complex scene like this. Thanks very much. Catch up with you next time.